Identity is not a competence.
Yes.
So you don't get good at this work simply because you show up in brown skin or in female gender. You get good at this work the same way you get good at any work, by study and practice. Study and practice. Laura and I have been at this 35 years plus. We got good at it because we dedicated ourselves to getting good at it. And I'm not good at it because I'm a brown-skinned man, and she's not good at it because she's female. We're good at it because we dedicated ourselves to perfecting this discipline.
This is the Rebel HR Podcast, the podcast where we talk to HR innovators about all things people leadership. If you're looking for places to find about new ways to think about the world of work, this is the podcast for you. Please subscribe from your favorite podcast listening platform today and leave us a review. Rebel on, HR Rebels. Welcome back, HR Rebels. Extremely excited for the conversation today. We are going to be talking about diversity training. Joining us today, we have James Rodgers and Laura Kangas. They have co-authored the new book, Diversity Training That Generates Real Change, Inclusive Approaches That Benefit Individuals, Business, and Society. So we are going to be talking all about diversity training that actually works. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Cal. It's good to be here.
Well, extremely excited to have both of you join us today, because I think this is exactly the type of thing that we started this podcast to talk about, and that is making sure that we put together tactics for our organizations that drive positive and inclusive change. And so I really appreciate this book being out there. I want to ask the first question. What prompted you both to collaborate on writing a book about diversity training?
So let me start, and Laura, you kind of give your point of view later. I was in the process of writing a book on diversity. My platform is diversity management, which is the original conception of diversity work started by Dr. Roosevelt Thomas. But over the last 30 years, I have collaborated with Laura and several of others. I call them the old soldiers in the field. And we've been out there doing really good work, transformative work in the classroom with people, so that individuals were better able to work on teams, and teams were better able to produce for their corporations. So that's where we came from. I just started writing the book about generic diversity and working with our coach at the publishing company. He convinced us we ought to focus it on the training component. And as we say, training is a necessary, but certainly not the entirety of a diversity initiative. And so we decided to put our heads together and come up with something that we thought was practical, based on experience, not theory, and has the clear, definable outcomes. And that's what the book is intended to do. Laura, what do you think?
Yes. And for me, writing the book was, first of all, a dream come true, especially to write it with Jim. We talked about it for years. But for me, it was the next step in sort of my contribution to this field. I was an HR manager in the early days of, we called it Valuing Differences, and we focused primarily on race and gender. And my experience was I went to about 70 of those workshops with my managers, most of whom were white men at the time. And they either said, this was the worst thing I ever went to, or don't ever ask me to go to one of those sessions again, because they didn't feel valued. They felt attacked. And I said to my manager, if there ever comes a chance where we could design a course internally, I'd like to be on that team. And as they say, the rest is history. So with a couple of colleagues, excellent HR people, we actually designed a course that was delivered to over 150,000 employees in an international company. It was a resounding success. And when I have been doing consulting at many different companies, having since started my own company, I just see diversity training in so many places that doesn't meet its goals, and people aren't excited, or it's a check the box. And so I thought, actually, this is going to get kind of spiritual. But before I left the planet, whenever that might be, I wanted to get into writing what I know works. And Jim and I are a really good balance in being able to give people a full picture of that on a global basis. So I'm very excited for the book, and we're hoping to start a revolution in DEI work through the book.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's such an important topic, and it's one of those things that I we were talking before I hit record. I've sat through the trainings,
Yes.
probably the exact values differences training I've sat through.
Yeah.
Actually, that's the
Not
title of
mine.
one of them I sat through, so I know what you're talking about. And but I think what's really important about this approach, and what I think is really powerful, is focusing on the tangible outcomes in an organization. And so as we think about that as HR professionals, I think that it sounds simple,
Mhm.
but actually setting tangible goals as it relates to DEI can be extremely challenging. And a lot of times what happens is it just kind of lands in our lap as, hey, we need to do something about this.
Mhm.
And inevitably then you've got HR professionals who, a lot of times, like myself included, I don't come from a learning and development background. I come from a business background. Certainly not an expert in adult education. I go and I just try to find something, right?
Right.
But that's not necessarily the right approach. So as we're considering this, and as we're getting challenged by both our leadership and our employees to address this critical topic, what advice do you have for us as we think about what tangible outcomes do we need to aspire to?
Mhm.
You can go first, Laura.
Okay, well, actually, you're speaking our language, because in the book, Diversity Training That Generates Real Change, as you talked about the title, we talk about the 6 building blocks. You cannot do this work unless you know why you're doing the work, which is the first building block. And that is not an easy, we want to do something or we want to copy other people. It really involves a very long, hopefully well facilitated conversation about what are we trying to accomplish here. And Jim, I know, has a lot of thoughts on that. And secondly, you need to know what your strategy is. So as we said, training is part of it, but our goal is that DEI becomes part of every business conversation. And how do you get that? Well, you get there by working with people. Funny, you said adult learning. We talk about the adult learning model in the book and how important that is. We talk about world-class facilitation, which is not about pouring information into people's heads and teaching them what to say. It's really having them connect with the work on a human basis. My feeling is, and I know Jim agrees with this, unless you make a human connection to this work that relates to your own life, you may get educated, but you're not going to get transformed. So you have to have the type of adult learning model and facilitation, and you have to know what a learning model is. So we talk in the book about expectation, examining, and then evaluating. And then finally, you have to really know how to execute. And maybe you can figure that out on your own, or certainly we recommend that you get people involved in your company. There are many ways to do that. And and measuring, well, you measure what you've decided that you are trying to accomplish. And as in it's funny because in any business challenge, you figure out steps. But in diversity, people often want DEI to solve everything. And you've got to break it down and have measurable goals and evaluate as you go along. Jim, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, that's well set up there, Laura, because that's really kind of the foundation of our work. My work has always been about, first of all, simplifying this. One thing that has happened, Cal, over the last 30 years is it's gotten what I call excessive complexity. So everybody makes up their own definition, their own outcome, their own purpose. And I just responded to an article on LinkedIn with this very idea. Isn't it great that with diversity, we can all make up? I said, no, it's not great. You'll never make progress until you have common language and a common understanding. So go back to my pet peeve is the first 2. What does success look like? People say diversity and diversity training don't work. How would you possibly know if you didn't have an expectation of what you were going to get? So you have to declare that up front. We want to produce a set of employees who know how to have solid, productive relationships with any other employee with that, despite their differences. And that is kind of the classroom work that Laura and I have been doing forever. We never talk about dimensions of diversity in the classroom. We talk about human beings. We talk about the human condition. We talk about all of us having the same proclivities. And what we have to do is to corral those so that our implicit biases, our unconscious bias, and our conscious bias don't derail us from having the kind of relationships that we need in order to be successful at whatever we're doing. So when it comes to people telling me what is the outcome, you know, I'm so that you understand, I'm an engineer by training. I grew up in the corporations as a P&L manager. I know how business operates. I know how executives think. So what I'm looking for is, what impact does this have on my business operations? So I'm not looking for any fluffy foo-foo type of measures. I'm looking for improved cycle times, increased revenue, lower costs, efficiency, effectiveness, those things. When you have a team of people who are operating well because of good management and acknowledgement of the differences, but focusing on their similarities, that's what you get. You get better business outcomes. And as I tell people, there's only one reason to do this. It's good for business.
We'll be back after a quick break.
And so used to having everything in front of them right away that we forget that innovation just takes time. I myself, I get frustrated too. Why? And you know, this is being one of my best friends is, hey, I talk to you all the time. Hey, man, I'm frustrated in the fact that I can't seem to just get there in the next day. But that's just not how these things work, right? Innovation needs to be planned out. It needs to be very methodical. And then when it finally hits, that's when it seems like to everyone else that it sort of just came out of nowhere. But to you, you know the amount of dedication that it took over that time.
Absolutely. And, you know, from my seat, you know, anecdotally, I've been able to see that, you know, as an organization has become more inclusive or become more open-minded or had a leader that was more inclusive than the previous leader, you see the business results happen, you know, and but at the end of the day, it's funny because, you know, I think we could probably have a whole podcast dedicated to the business case for diversity, but at the end of the day, it's also just, you know, the right thing to do, right? It's like it does come back to the, you know, it's our shared humanity, and it's, you know, shouldn't we just all treat each other with the same level of respect? But often what I have found is, especially with people who would consider themselves, you know, non-diverse, they feel like, well, I'm already respectful, you know, or I don't, you know, why do I need this training? This is for others. This isn't for me, you know, and that's part of the challenge that, you know, diversity training a lot of times is trying to solve. So what, you know, what advice or tactics do you have as you are setting some of these organizational goals, and you're starting to communicate, and you're starting to plan, and you're figuring out what good diversity training looks like? How do you address those individuals that feel like, you know, I've already got this figured out. I don't think this is for me. How do you address that?
If you don't mind, Jim, I'd love to tell a quick story that's in the book, actually. Well, first of all, Kyle, you're right on in that it comes down to the individual. So our job, and I believe in an introductory or even intermediate DEI training, would be to have people make a connection to the work. And once they have the personal connection and they understand what happens around DEI, they never quite look at the world the same. I'll share a quick example. We had one of those people that said, I am respectful, happened to be a white man, I do everything right, plant manager, very smart guy, yada, yada. And we did an exercise, and this is one of the gifts that that I think the book will be, is that we recommend doing many different types of exercises, and we share some of them in the book. So we did this exercise called the list exercise, when different categories were on easel chart paper. And we told people to write down everything they'd ever heard about that group. They may or may not believe it. And one of the groups was Vietnam veterans. And so we asked people, once all the lists were up there, we asked them to go select a list that had a charge for them. That could be positive or negative. So we were waiting, and this plant manager had not gone. Everybody else had. So finally, he walked over to the list of Vietnam veterans, and he said to us, I am a Vietnam veteran, and I've never told anybody this. And because I didn't want them to know, because I know that they would judge me on it. And then he went on to tell stories about how he was spat at, he was humiliated by crowds. And he said, and what I realized in this moment is that's something that I could hide. But there are people in this room in our company that can't hide their differences, that they are judged on every single day. And he became one of our biggest advocates. And he said, without that experience, he never would have understood. So you have to try to get it to a personal transformational experience. And that's where you need facilitation, not judgment, not dictation, facilitation.
Yeah, that's a really good example, Cal, of what we try to do. One of the first things we do, we anticipate that people will come with that attitude to the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so the very first exercise that we have is one where we will allow them to discover, maybe I don't have it all together. So we go take them through an exercise. An example of it is an F card exercise where the majority of people will make a mistake. It would be an opportunity for them to say, there's something right in front of me that I just don't see. I have a blind spot. And we don't tell them they have a blind spot. We let them discover it. Our learning model is experience. We will provide the experience, but the participant will have their own discovery. We'll allow them an opportunity to think of the implications of that, and then we'll encourage them to think about the application of that. So that's the cycle that we go through in the classroom. And what the things like that happen with the example Laura gave, that stuff travels within an organization. So you get it started, and the folklore that comes out of that, man, you if you were reluctant about going to diversity training, bro, change your mind, because this is a life-changing event. Mm-hmm. I tell the story of one of my clients, and we basically said this would be the most transformational learning experience you've ever had. And with 100% of their employees, that was the outcome that we got. A lot of them really, they heard the word diversity. Man, I want nothing about that, because if I'm a white male, I'm going to be shamed and blamed and blah, blah, blah. And then they come out of that going back to the workplace saying, man, that was awesome. Because that's what we want to do. It has to be an attractive experience, yes, so that people want to go.
And people of color realize the stereotypes they hold about white people and other people of color. Yeah. It has to be a full 360-degree conversation. Sometimes we talk about it as diversity training needs to be the great equalizer in terms of understanding. We really encourage people not to get stuck in anger, shame, guilt, whatever. What we really want to do is facilitate understanding, and that we really are all in this together, and we need everyone to make it work. But you see, you get the type of commitment then that you could never pay somebody enough for. They feel it in their heart, their head, heart, and mind. That then then it's just, let's get better. And they'll become your diversity champions and troubadours.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, what's really powerful about that approach, I think, is it's the challenge that HR professionals have to face, which is a lot of times this just becomes an HR initiative, right? Mm-hmm. It's just, it's under your job title. You go figure it out, right. And that's not anybody else's thing. But, this type of approach, you're evangelizing people to make this much broader. And in my opinion, it definitely should be. Mm-hmm. What's your perspective on, I know we've talked about facilitation. What's your perspective on HR actually being a facilitator? Or or is your perspective that, it really makes more sense to bring in somebody that's a kind of a neutral third party? Any thoughts on that?
Well, Laura, let me start with this one, because this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. First of all, DEI training is very introspective and personal. This is deep learning training. It's always best
Or
to
it
have
should
an
be.
impartial, objective facilitator, someone who has no skin in the game in terms of what the company is doing, but is there solely to be a vehicle to which people dive into their own deep learning. I have had so many clients where they have asked, well, can't you just teach us how to do this? I said, sure, I can. But in the end, you're going to decide not to do it. So why don't we just skip that step and go ahead and allow me to put together a faculty of people who know how to deliver this work. So I have a bias on that based on years of experience. I have actually had a couple of clients where they have actually put together a team of insiders, HR professionals. And once they've been in the classroom once with my professionals, they said, this is probably better for them to do it because I'm feeling something from a company insider perspective that may not be so helpful in the facilitation process. So I just think you're better off if you allow professionals to do it.
Yeah, and I appreciate everything you say, Jim, and I could certainly back all of that up. And I also want to say that I have had the experience of training people internally, but it was a very extensive, long training period, and they always facilitated with somebody from my staff, and so you had a balance, And what that did help is sometimes companies don't have the resources, and also now these people became very much more skilled employees of the company. So I could see how I think Jim's is in the best of all worlds, but I also think that there are ways that we can work with that can be very powerful. And then what you do is when you want to offer a even deeper workshop with just outside facilitators, but I think there's room for something in between if it's those type of challenges.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, my perspective is it's really pretty situationally dependent.
Mhm.
A lot of it is going to be based upon, the resources that you have available. Um, I can honestly say that part of my diversity journey has been making sure that when we go through our annual budgeting process, we actually set aside dollars for it. Right.
Yes.
And then and that it is something that is, not only supported at the HR level, but supported at the finance level and ultimately at the CEO level.
Hmm.
Because, the money is the language of business. So if you're going, if this is important to you, then you should be applying, budgetary dollars and focusing on it. But I mean, I can honestly say, and you know, I, I've done a lot of training, but diversity training, at least especially internal to my organization, for me, I'm just not extremely comfortable facilitating that. First of all, I'm a white man from the Midwest, and training somebody that's from a completely different geographic region of the world or has completely different perspectives. I can train out of my context, but I can't necessarily train. Um, you know, from others' contexts, and so it's just very, very challenging in my opinion.
Jim, would you speak
So
to that? Because we have a strong feeling about, yeah, go ahead, Jim, about people having to
yeah,
match.
so Kyle,
Yeah,
you probably knew we were going to push back on that.
yes,
White male from the Midwest is not a disqualifier.
exactly.
In fact, it is
It is
one
not
of
at
the
all.
chief criteria for having on our team. Laura will tell you, we've worked on maybe a dozen faculties together, and those faculties include a large percentage of white men, white women, black men, black women, Asians, gay and lesbian.
Hispanics, yeah,
We try to cut across all of those differences because what we want are expert facilitators in front of the room.
yes,
See, what the facilitator does is they don't bring an issue into the room. They bring process excellence into the room.
right,
And so being a white male who is skilled at facilitation is certainly not a disqualifier. And in fact, in certain organizations, it's a real plus because people need to see white men as full partners in this process.
right.
Because unfortunately, we've done a bad job of elevating this to where it is total. I tell my colleagues all the time, you all are promoting inclusion by deliberately excluding one part of our population. And that is just not a workable solution. So
And Jim
that's what
also,
Laura and I would say to you about that.
right. And Jim often talks about how the color of one's skin is not a criteria for excellence in this work, has
Yeah.
nothing or something like that. He has a way of saying it. But I can tell you, you're already ahead of the game because you are identifying with being a white man from the Midwest. So already you're thinking about, who am I? How does that play into this? And really I believe anyone who has the commitment, the dedication, and the authenticity and ethics around this work, if they work hard enough, can be an excellent facilitator internationally. I've done many workshops overseas. And it's not about your background. It's about, as Jim said, your skills and the process that you use in this work, which is universal.
So
I should
Kyle,
restate that. I don't necessarily trust my facilitation skills.
Well, that's a different,
there you go.
that's a
There you go.
different topic. But we can work
Yeah,
with
that's
you.
a whole other thing.
We can work with you.
Now let me make this comment. Laura alluded to it, but it's important for people to hear in this podcast. Identity is not a competence.
Yes.
So you don't get good at this work simply because you show up in brown skin or in female gender. You get good at this work the same way you get good at any work, by study and practice. Study and practice. Laura and I have been at this 35 years plus. We got good at it because we dedicated ourselves to getting good at it. And I'm not good at it because I'm a brown-skinned man, and she's not good at it because she's female. We're good at it because we dedicated ourselves to perfecting this discipline.
Yeah, I love that approach, and I think it's really important. I do think, the other thing, and you mentioned this, Laura, that in some organizations, it can be a benefit to look like the people that you're training, and right, wrong, or indifferent, and sometimes that is the case. The only other thing I would say about taking my personal identity out of it is the other fact is and I appreciate the pushback. I was kind of hoping that we'd have good dialogue there, but the other thing I would say, though, for having HR facilitated is you also run the risk of now it's just an HR thing.
Yeah.
And so I would actually encourage,
Yes.
if somebody's thinking about internal facilitation, especially if you don't have like a learning and development group, if you're not that big, if you're going to train an internal facilitator, look for somebody outside of human resources
Right.
that
Yeah.
has the skill set, but so that it's not just an HR thing, right?
Great.
Right. And we had many managers step up of all different backgrounds, and it was wonderful.
And in fact, part of our learning design is we would quite often have the senior leaders come in to kick off the
Yes.
session. And depending on how popular they were, it really made a big difference. People who came in and really skeptical. In one example, there was a very popular CEO.
Mhm.
And just the fact that Mike would come in and say, guys, let me tell you what I experienced when I went through this. Man, it was transformational. It changed so many hearts and minds in that moment that it made it easier for us as facilitators to get everybody on the same page and moving towards personal perfection or personal introspection. So it does matter.
And when they come in, I think to build on that, Jim, is to have them be vulnerable and be humble and talk about their own challenges and what they learned and how they learned it. I often coach senior executives and say, they're probably no one's going to go deeper than you do. So you really have to set the tone here. And if you really want people to do this work, you've got to be willing to be vulnerable, be authentic, and share the good, the bad, and the ugly.
There you go. Absolutely.
Absolutely. I think that's a really powerful point. And I think, as I reflect on the workplaces that I've been fortunate to lead and been a part of, those workplaces where the culture allows you to be that open and honest and to explore, things that potentially cause either, internal or even sometimes external conflicts to kind of work through. But those are the organizations, those are the cultures, to your point, Jim, earlier, those are the ones that win because they're open with each other and they're open to that type of experience. And you know what? That just makes better decisions.
Yep.
better business result. It really can drive an organization forward, even if it's uncomfortable to begin with.
Right. And see, just the way you're talking about that, no one's ever going to have to convince you twice because you get it. And
Yeah.
that's what you want to do through diversity training. You don't want to have to, you won't ever have, with good diversity training, you won't ever have to convince someone again or try to convince them.
Yep.
And that's where we're wasting money and hours and, worst of all, time. We're 150 years too late. We've got to do it right, and we've got to demand that people do it right, or don't do it at all, because that will just make it worse.
Yeah, the last thing you want is for people to leave that check the box diversity training and go, check the box on that one. Never have to think
Right.
about that again.
Exactly.
Or feel like they're they're under scrutiny, or they are less than. It's almost like the antithesis of what you want from diversity training.
Exactly.
Right?
You want them
could be
to go
worse.
out. You want them to go out saying, how can I learn more? How can I keep working on this?
Yeah.
And we want it to keep them up at night.
Yeah. But to all your point, I think, and I appreciate the, kind of the comments about, my awareness of this topic and kind of my perspective.
Mhm.
But it really, I don't think there's no special, acknowledgement required for me. I went through a very powerful personal experience, both personally and in the workplace, where I saw how important this is. And, I kind of lived it. Right. And to go back to the whole purpose of adult education, and kind of the idea is, you're just helping people discover the truth on their own.
Exactly.
You're not trying to force them to come to your way of thinking. That,
Absolutely.
I'm still waiting to see where that works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So really powerful approach.
It can.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I really, really appreciate the time. I think, really kind of challenging, our conventional norms and the way that we think about this. I want to shout out the name of the book one more time. It's Diversity Training That Generates Real Change, Inclusive Approaches That Benefit Individuals, Business, and Society. It's available for purchase right now, but I think, really powerful topics. And if you're considering diversity training, or you've been disappointed in diversity training in the past, I would encourage you to study up and start to open your mind to a different way of doing things. So with that in mind, I want to shift gears. We're going to go into the Rebel HR Flash Round. And I'm fascinated to hear these questions. So first question, I'm not sure who wants it. I'll let that be a grab bag here. Where does HR need to rebel?
Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, I thought you'd take that one, that being a former HR rebel yourself, Laura, but I'm going to take it. I'm going to tell you from my standpoint, HR needs to become more business focused. Part of my observation, and Laura will tell you, I don't really do that well with HR people because I speak strategy, I speak P&L, I speak business drivers, and quite often my HR colleagues don't understand what I'm talking about. And this work is about, like I said, it's good for business. And so you need people promoting it who understand how the business works. So the second piece of our building block is strategy. One of the things that HR people need to understand is what strategy is, not just throw the word around so that they sound impressive, but actually study what is strategy. Strategy is about how do you position the organization so that they win in a competitive environment. So in other words, how are we going to take this island? We need to get to the high ground so that we can see every area of the island. How are we going to win in the marketplace? We have to have the lowest price. We have to have the highest quality. It's about positioning your business. And one of the ways you position your business is by having the most productive people and teams. And that's where D&I comes in.
Absolutely.
I would like to may I just quickly comment on that? I just want to say where people in HR are as vulnerable to the stereotypes about HR, just as much as white women are vulnerable to the stereotypes about white women. We call that internalized racism, a portion of it. So I'd say HR has to find their personal power and know that their voice is equally important to everyone else's. to add that to everything that Jim said.
Right.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think, my perspective, I've had this conversation with a number of HR professionals is, I view our role as, you're not just HR, right?
That's right.
Just on quotation marks. You can't see my hands, but what you really should focus on is being a business leader that has HR as your function.
Yes.
Right. And if you do that and you actually operate that way, your function becomes much more effective because, we're influencers, right? We're not necessarily out there driving sales, but we are driving the strategies to hire the people that are driving sales, right? And
Yep.
so
Right.
we have markets. We have, we need to do a SWOT analysis on what we're doing. Our markets just have to be people. And instead of thinking about it like a product, our product is our culture. It's our it's our company. It's we have a value proposition, and we need to be thinking about our HR in that context. And the other thing I would say for an HR professional that's listening to this and thinking, well, I'm not very good at that. If you get good at it, those are the HR people that ascend within an organization as well. Because if you get the people part right, which is, in my opinion, is one of the hardest parts to get right, then the rest of the stuff's easy.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, we don't have time. We could go through. This is supposed to be the flash round, and we're chasing squirrels here. But it's just such a rich conversation, and I really appreciate the feedback. Okay, question number 2: who should we be listening to?
So let me start and say, not who you think. If you're really interested and focused on DEI excellence, you need to find the people who really know how to do the work. You need to find a Laura Kangas who's been doing it for a while. Unfortunately, we have a whole new crop of people who have dropped into the middle of this conversation and declared themselves experts. One of the things that I tell people in any discipline or any initiative, you have to do your homework. Go back and look at the history. Why did we start this? What was the intent? What problem were we trying to solve? What were the solutions that were offered? And where do we find ourselves now? Without that type of background, all you are doing is just listening to the latest rhetoric and buying into it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think there's, this is probably going to sound terrible, but it's like, you don't want this to be like a fad, right?
Yes.
But there is a risk, and there's been so many operators that I think have a high level of passion for this type of work. I think there's some people that saw it and thought, oh, I can monetize this. But as an HR professional, especially if you're in charge of the learning and development budget and doing this training, you owe it to your organization to make sure that you vet the individuals that are helping you with the work. You own that, right? And so I think it's a great call out, and it's something that is a risk in the marketplace right now.
No doubt.
All right, last question. How can our listeners connect with you and learn more?
Okay, for me, you can go to Laura Kangas, LauraKangas.com, or email me at lkangas@laurakangas.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn. Thanks so much, Kyle. Jim?
Yeah, I also am on LinkedIn, Facebook. I have 3 sites on LinkedIn and 2 on Facebook. Also, I have 2 websites. One is jamesorodgers.com and thediversitycoach.com. So I would encourage anyone who is serious about the work, not just curious, but serious about the work, to get in touch with us and let us drop a little of our experience on you before you try to get started without knowing where you're going.
And
Absolutely. And read the book. And we will have all that in the show notes.
You can take that book to a CEO, to your senior managers, and say, this is how we need to do it. This is why it has not worked.
Yep.
That's our goal. And let's start a revolution. Let's do it. We're capable of this.
I love it. And thank you for the help, because I can use all the help I can get. So we're trying to figure out how to do this. So I really appreciate it. It's been absolutely wonderful connecting with both of you. We will have all that information in the show notes. So open up your podcast player, click right in. You'll be able to click to the book and connect with James and Laura. It's just been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you for the opportunity. Keep going.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care.
Take care.
All right, that does it for the Rebel HR podcast. Big thank you to our guests. Follow us on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, Twitter at Rebel HR Guy, or see our website at rebelhumanresources.com. The views and opinions expressed by Rebel HR Podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any of the organizations that we represent. No animals were harmed during the filming of this podcast.
Baby.